China today stands as the world's third largest country by land area and the second most populated nation on Earth. But what truly sets China apart is not just its sheer size or population. What makes it unique is its unbroken thread of civilization, stretching back more than 5,000 years. While ancient societies like Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley flourished and then faded, China endured. It preserved its cultural identity, its political traditions, and its civilizational framework for millennia. The natural question arises: how did China manage to survive and thrive for so long when so many other civilizations collapsed? The answer lies largely in one powerful factor: geography. When we think of geography, we often picture mountains, rivers, deserts, and oceans simply as physical features on a map. But history shows us that geography is destiny. It shapes how societies live, what they grow, how they defend themselves, and how they interact with outsiders. In China's case, the land itself provided the foundation for its extraordinary continuity. The heart of the story begins with the Central Plains, or Zhongyuan in Chinese. These fertile lands are widely regarded as the cradle of Chinese civilization. Here, some of the earliest dynasties, such as the Xia and Shang, emerged thousands of years ago. The Central Plains were not just an isolated fertile patch. When expanded outward, this region connects into the vast North China Plain, Huabei Pingyuan, an area of farmland so large it can be compared in size to the U.S. states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky combined. Imagine a stretch of land that expansive, flat, and fertile. It is no wonder that this became the demographic and cultural core of China for thousands of years. With land that productive, large populations could be supported, which in turn gave rise to complex societies and centralized states. Running through this heartland are two mighty rivers that have defined China's history: the Yellow River, Huanghe, and the Yangtze River, Changjiang. The Yellow River has often been called both China's sorrow and China's mother. On the one hand, it sustained early civilizations with its fertile silt deposits, providing the basis for agriculture. On the other hand, its violent floods brought chaos and destruction, forcing communities to constantly adapt. The Yangtze, by contrast, is calmer and far larger. It is the longest river in Eurasia and the third longest in the world. Together, the Yellow and Yangtze rivers gave China an unparalleled advantage: vast supplies of fresh water, fertile soil, and natural routes for transportation. Both of these rivers trace their origins to the Tibetan Plateau, often described as the water tower of Asia. This plateau holds the largest reserve of fresh water outside the polar regions, with glaciers feeding not only Chinese rivers, but also those that sustain India and Southeast Asia, such as the Ganges. This is why control over Tibet has always been considered of critical strategic importance, not only historically but even today under the Chinese Communist Party. Whoever controls Tibet controls the headwaters of Asia's great rivers, and thus holds influence over hundreds of millions of lives. The geography of China's river basins provided something else of enormous importance: agricultural surplus. Just as the Romans invaded Britain for its farmland and natural resources, China's Central Plains would have been an irresistible prize for any outside power. Yet what made China different was that these fertile lands were surrounded by powerful natural barriers, mountains, deserts, and oceans, that made invasions far more difficult. This protective cocoon gave China the breathing room to develop its unique culture and governance without constant external threats. The role of the rivers in shaping Chinese society went beyond farming. Because the Yellow River's floods were so destructive, communities had to work together to build irrigation systems, levees, and flood controls. This forced collective action, which in turn planted the seeds for centralized governance. Unlike in some parts of the world where fragmented tribes could exist independently, in China cooperation was essential for survival. Over centuries, this tendency crystallized into dynasties and imperial rule. Geography had nudged China toward centralization. Over time, the rivers also created distinct regional identities. The north, centered around the Yellow River, became a wheat and millet economy, while the south, nourished by the Yangtze, specialized in rice cultivation. These complementary systems created a diversified agricultural base that was far more stable than civilizations reliant on a single crop. This diversity allowed China to sustain enormous populations and avoid the collapse that often befell monocrop societies. Just as important was the role of rivers in transportation and communication. While in other parts of the world it could take weeks or months to move goods or armies across rough terrain, China's waterways acted like natural highways. The Yellow and Yangtze, along with their countless tributaries, allowed goods, people, and ideas to flow across great distances with relative ease. This interconnectedness eventually inspired the creation of the Grand Canal, the longest man-made waterway in the world, linking the Yellow and Yangtze basins and binding the empire together. If we step back, we can see that China's geography acted not just as a shield but also as an engine of development. Fertile land ensured food security. Abundant fresh water made irrigation and farming possible. Natural highways fostered internal unity. And the need for collective management of floods and irrigation encouraged the rise of strong states. From its very beginning, China's physical environment was molding it into a civilization built for longevity. In short, the Central Plains and the great rivers of China gave birth to a society that had the resources to grow, the stability to endure, and the internal connections to remain united. This is why China, unlike so many other ancient civilizations, was able to sustain itself for thousands of years. Geography did not merely influence Chinese civilization, it defined it. The story of China's survival through the centuries cannot be understood without looking at its protective shield of natural barriers. While fertile plains and rivers gave China its foundation, the surrounding mountains, deserts, and seas created a fortress that kept invaders at bay. To the west rises the Tibetan Plateau, a massive highland often referred to as the roof of the world. At over 4,500 meters above sea level, this plateau forms an almost impenetrable wall. Beyond it lie the harsh deserts and mountains of Central Asia, making it incredibly difficult for armies to invade China from that direction. The only feasible routes through were narrow passes such as the Hashi Corridor, which would later become a vital part of the Silk Road. This natural bottleneck meant that any invasion from the west had to pass through predictable and easily defended choke points, giving China a huge defensive advantage. To the north lay the vast steppe and desert lands of Mongolia and Inner Asia. Here lived nomadic tribes such as the Xiongnu, Mongols, and Manchus, who over centuries harassed, raided, and sometimes conquered Chinese lands. The open terrain of the steppe gave these horse-riding peoples an unmatched advantage in mobility and warfare. Yet even here, China found ways to adapt. The building of the Great Wall, stretching thousands of kilometers, was one of history's most ambitious attempts to turn geography into defense. Though the wall was not always effective at keeping out invaders, it symbolized China's determination to secure its vulnerable northern frontier. More importantly, it showed how China recognized geography as both a threat and a tool for survival. To the east, the Pacific Ocean provided another natural shield. Unlike Europe, where coastlines opened civilizations to constant trade, migration, and invasion, China's eastern seaboard offered a measure of isolation. For much of its history, China was inward-looking, seeing itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, with little need for contact with distant lands. This relative isolation helped preserve Chinese culture from being diluted or overtaken by outside influences. However, it also meant that when maritime powers like Portugal, Britain, and Japan arrived centuries later, China was not as prepared for seaborne threats. To the south, the dense jungles, mountains, and rivers of Southeast Asia formed another barrier. Though China exerted influence over regions like Vietnam, the terrain made large-scale conquest difficult. As a result, China's southern frontier was relatively secure, allowing it to focus its attention on the more immediate challenges of the north and west. Taken together, these barriers created what some historians call a geographical cocoon. Within this cocoon, Chinese civilization was free to grow without being constantly destroyed by external invasions, as happened in Mesopotamia or the Indian subcontinent. But geography did not only protect China, it also shaped its worldview. Because China was so insulated, it often saw foreign peoples as barbarians and viewed itself as self-sufficient. This sense of centrality is reflected in the term Zhonghua, which literally means Middle Kingdom. Geography had given China both the confidence and the reality of being at the center of its known world. Yet, China's protective geography was not an absolute guarantee of safety. When nomadic tribes were strong, such as under Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan, even China's defenses could be breached. The Mongol conquest in the 13th century and the later Manchu conquest in the 17th century proved that despite mountains, deserts, and walls, China was not invincible. Still, even after these invasions, the conquerors often adopted Chinese culture and institutions rather than replacing them. Geography had created such a strong and self-contained civilization that outsiders found themselves assimilated into China rather than the other way around. This resilience was one of the most remarkable effects of China's natural environment. Another crucial dimension of China's geography was its internal diversity. While the north and south were bound together by the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, the regions differed in climate, agriculture, and culture. The north, with its cold winters and reliance on wheat, fostered different lifestyles than the warm, humid south, where rice cultivation dominated. Over time, these differences could have fractured the country. Instead, geography's natural highways, the rivers and later the Grand Canal, helped tie these regions into a single economic and political unit. The Grand Canal, stretching over 1,700 kilometers, became one of the most important tools for unifying the empire. It allowed grain from the fertile south to be transported to the populous north, feeding armies and cities alike. Without this geographical link, China might have split permanently into northern and southern states, as it occasionally did during times of weakness. Instead, the physical landscape encouraged reunification whenever divisions occurred. Geography also determined China's external relations. Because of its barriers, China often chose to engage with the world on its own terms. Trade flowed along the Silk Road, but China was usually the dominant partner, exporting silk, porcelain, and tea in exchange for horses and other goods. The country's geography meant it was rarely forced into submission by outside powers until the age of European imperialism. Even then, it took immense global shifts, industrial revolutions, naval supremacy, and modern weaponry to truly break through China's protective shell. At its core, China's geography gave it two key gifts: protection and continuity. Other civilizations rose and fell because they were too exposed to external invasions or too dependent on single resources. Mesopotamia, for example, had fertile land but no natural defenses, making it a crossroads constantly overrun by new empires. Egypt had the Nile but was vulnerable to foreign powers coming from both Asia and the Mediterranean. India had rich lands but faced repeated invasions through the northwest. China, by contrast, had the perfect combination: fertile river valleys to sustain civilization and natural barriers to protect it. This balance explains why Chinese civilization endured when so many others crumbled. In the end, geography was not destiny in the sense that it guaranteed China's success. Rather, it set the stage. It gave China the tools, resources, and protection to build something extraordinary. The decisions of its rulers, the resilience of its people, and the adaptability of its culture all played roles. But without the unique geographical setting, its rivers, plains, mountains, deserts, and seas, China would never have become the continuous civilization it is today. Trade and economic development in China were also deeply shaped by geography, and nowhere is this more evident than in the interaction between China's fertile core and the vast trade networks that connected it to the wider world. The rivers and plains of northern and southern China created a surplus of agricultural goods that could feed enormous populations. But this surplus also freed people to specialize in crafts, technology, and commerce. The abundance of natural resources, silk from mulberry trees, porcelain from kaolin clay, tea from southern highlands, and salt from coastal plains, turned China into one of the most desirable trading partners in the ancient and medieval world. Geography ensured that these goods were not only abundant, but also transportable. The Yangtze River, in particular, acted as a commercial superhighway, carrying rice and manufactured goods from the south to the north, while the Grand Canal extended this reach even further. This system created an internal market far larger than that of most other civilizations, fueling urban growth and technological innovation. The Silk Road is perhaps the most famous example of geography linking China to the world. Stretching thousands of kilometers across Central Asia, the Silk Road was not a single path but a network of trade routes that connected China to India, Persia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Geography dictated that this trade had to move through narrow corridors such as the Hashi Corridor and through oasis cities like Dunhuang and Kashgar, which became hubs of cultural exchange. Through these routes, silk, paper, and gunpowder traveled westward, while horses, glassware, and precious metals came eastward. Yet it was not just goods that moved along these routes. Ideas, religions, and technologies also spread. Buddhism entered China from India along the Silk Road, profoundly influencing Chinese philosophy and culture. Islam and Christianity too made their way into Chinese cities through these same geographical pathways. This demonstrates how geography not only shaped China's economy, but also enriched its culture by exposing it to the broader world. However, the Silk Road was never entirely secure. Geography that had once shielded China also posed challenges, for the same deserts and mountains that made China hard to invade also made trade difficult. Sandstorms, treacherous mountain passes, and long stretches without water made overland trade risky and expensive. As a result, China also turned to maritime routes. The geography of China's coastline, particularly the sheltered harbors of the south like Guangzhou and Quanzhou, enabled the rise of maritime trade networks. By the Tang and Song dynasties, these ports had become vibrant centers of global commerce. Chinese ships, aided by the monsoon winds, sailed to Southeast Asia, India, and even as far as the Middle East and East Africa. The Indian Ocean trade became just as important as the Silk Road, and in many ways more stable and profitable. Geography once again played a decisive role. While deserts and mountains restricted overland trade, the predictable monsoon winds made sea routes efficient. During the Song dynasty, China saw an economic revolution in which its geographic resources were harnessed to unprecedented effect. The fertile rice paddies of the south, supported by innovations such as Compo rice from Vietnam, allowed multiple harvests a year, boosting food supply and population growth. Iron ore deposits fueled advancements in metallurgy, while coal reserves near Kaifeng and later in Shaanxi powered the early development of industry. All of this was possible because of the way China's geography concentrated resources within accessible areas. Unlike Europe, where resources were scattered across many countries, China's vast territory meant that it could draw upon almost everything it needed without depending heavily on outsiders. This geographical self-sufficiency is one reason why China often saw itself as the center of the world. Yet, geography also made China vulnerable in ways it did not always anticipate. Maritime trade brought wealth, but it also exposed China to piracy and foreign naval powers. The Mongol invasion, despite the Great Wall, proved that northern defenses could be breached by a highly organized steppe power. Later, in the 19th century, Britain exploited China's coastal geography during the Opium Wars, forcing China to open treaty ports under humiliating conditions. In these moments, geography that had once been a strength became a weakness, as outsiders learned to exploit China's natural features against it. Another key aspect of geography's role in China's development was the way it structured internal unity and fragmentation. The North-South divide, while bridged by the Grand Canal and river systems, remained a constant source of tension. During times of political weakness, China often split along these lines, with northern dynasties controlling the Yellow River Valley and southern dynasties controlling the Yangtze region. Geography made both regions viable centers of power, which explains why reunification was always possible. Unlike civilizations where peripheral areas were too weak to challenge the core, China had multiple fertile regions capable of sustaining great states. This gave Chinese history its unique rhythm of division and reunification, always drawn back together by the gravitational pull of its geography. The interaction of geography and politics also explains China's technological leadership for much of history. Irrigation, flood control, and canal building demanded large-scale organization and state capacity. In turn, this fostered innovation in engineering, mathematics, and bureaucracy. The invention of paper, printing, and gunpowder were not accidents, but products of a civilization that had both the resources and the social structures to sustain innovation. Geography created the conditions for this cycle of surplus, specialization, and invention. Yet, It also meant that China saw little need to seek innovation abroad, relying on its own immense internal market. This inward orientation, shaped by geography, would later become a disadvantage when Europe surged ahead during the age of exploration and industrialization. Even so, China's geographical strengths allowed it to remain the largest economy in the world for much of history, only surpassed by Europe in the 19th century. From the earliest dynasties to the late imperial period, geography provided the base upon which Chinese civilization was built. Fertile river valleys sustained its people. Natural barriers protected its borders, internal waterways unified its regions, and external trade routes connected it to the wider world. At every stage, geography dictated both the opportunities and the challenges China faced. It is no exaggeration to say that without its unique geography, China would not have become the enduring and powerful civilization it has been. China's geography has always shaped its security, economy, culture, and politics. Natural barriers like deserts, mountains, and seas protected it, while fertile river valleys supported massive population growth. This geography made China inward-looking as the Middle Kingdom, unlike Europe, which expanded outward. Conquerors like the Mongols and Manchus were absorbed into Chinese civilization, showing the land's cultural depth. In the 19th century, however, the same rivers and coasts that once fueled trade left China vulnerable to European imperialism. In modern times, control of frontier regions like Tibet and Xinjiang, as well as strategic choke points such as the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea, remain vital. Even today, despite challenges like climate change and regional divides, China's geography continues to explain both its resilience and survival as one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations.